Hello, this is Jerry Morton. Welcome to my Finding My Way podcast. This is podcast number 27, titled Misery. Misery is a story from my adult years, the collection of stories I have written and am reading to you cover many subcultures in our country that I have interacted with from childhood to my adult and senior years. A more extensive introduction to the Finding My Way stories takes place in the beginning of Podcast 1. Regardless of which podcast you are listening to, you will find the story both entertaining and worthy of your reflective thoughts concerning its contents. The stories, as a collection, provide insights into a span of time that has played a role in shaping American culture and influencing its future. The stories provide you with a sense of admiration for the culture's collective courage and our country's commitment to justice and its optimistic willingness to address new challenges. Misery. Now, honey, please don't pick up any hitchhikers on this trip, my caring wife cautioned. With reluctance, and in the middle of the final packing, I replied, "Okay." "You won't even be driving our car. It's a rental. What happens if you pick up a hitchhiker and something happens to the car?" Okay. I worry about what would happen. That's all. We love you too much. Please promise not to pick someone up." Grabbing her in a hug and giving her a kiss, I promised. This was my first big-time presentation. I was actually being paid as a presenter to a group of students on working with gifted children at Cape Girardeau University. It would be an all-day presentation. They were paying all of my expenses, plus a nice little fee. The pre-arrangements had been made by phone and covered by our one credit card. That was a good thing. We were still a week from the end of the month. That was a week from payday. Cash was really tight in our household budget. Sweet wife always wanted me to have enough money on my trips. I assured her that $10 would cover my 2 evening meals with $1 or $2 left over for unexpected expenses. In 1977, $5 got you an acceptable meal almost anywhere. Cape Girardeau, Missouri, would be a new experience for me. When I was about 2 years old, my family had lived in East St. Louis. It was right at the end of the Second World War. My dad had just gotten home, and so had Uncle Jim. We didn't live there for long, as the family found a rental house across the river in Granite City, Illinois. I'd fly from Knoxville, Tennessee to Memphis and then to St. Louis. In St. Louis, I'd rent a car at the airport. Arrangements had been made for me to stay that Friday night at a motel near the airport. I'd get up early Saturday morning. I'd get up really early to drive the 3 hours to Cape Girardeau and arrive by 9 a.m. to start the presentation. Saturday evening, I'd drive the 3 hours or so back to the hotel at the airport. Then it was an early wake-up to be able to catch a 5 a.m. flight back to Knoxville. The hotel provided a free continental breakfast. It wasn't likely they'd be serving at 4 a.m. My wake-up call for the return trip was scheduled for 3:30 that morning to ensure I had time to dress, brush my teeth, return the car, and get to the boarding gate on time. Of course, it was dark most of the drive to the university. I couldn't see much of the land I was passing through. From the looks of things, once you got out of St. Louis, it was a no-man's land. There weren't any lights on for houses, farms, or small towns. Well, maybe it was just that everyone was sleeping. That late, cold January pre-dawn morning was really cold. What made matters worse was the constant biting wind. It just pushed the cold into any break in your clothing. I hadn't expected it to be this cold. It was miserable. My sports jacket provided little protection. It was just plain cold. The presentation went well until about 2 or 3 in the afternoon. One of the participants started it off. Have you noticed that the gifted children seem to be drawn towards psychic phenomena? Well, yes and no. Just what do you mean? Laughing, I said, I'm not sure what I mean. I had the topic raised by one high school student. He reported a feeling, a kind of experience he would have from time to time. He said that he finally decided that he was having an out-of-body experience. He wanted to know if it could be true or if maybe there was something wrong with him. I was quick to explain that I was not a physician. He might want to discuss this with his doctor. There were physiological conditions that might explain what was causing the feelings. He went on to explain why he thought it was an out-of-body experience. He cited being in other rooms in his house looking down on family members as they discussed certain topics. The next morning he would ask one of his family members if they had said whatever it was he heard them say during the out-of-body observation of them. He said they were astounded that he would know what they had discussed in such detail. He had gotten several confirmations that he was somehow gaining information in some mysterious manner. Well, what did you tell him? I told him that I could not confirm or deny the reality of his experience. There were a lot of books on the subject in the popular literature. I told him what I knew Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and the Edgar Cayce material said on the topic. I also provided the various scientific explanations I was aware of that might provide an account of the phenomena in a more conventional manner. I really felt uncomfortable with the direction the questions were going. In my own mind, I still hadn't worked out a solid place for myself concerning psychic phenomena. While I had spent a lot of spare time exploring the topic, I didn't want to tell them that. There was no doubt that I had encountered some things that I could not begin to explain using what I knew about the scientific realities as to how the world works on a three-dimensional plane. I didn't want to tell these people that, but I also wanted to be truthful with them in answering their questions. I just wanted these kinds of questions to stop. My comfort level had been seriously disturbed. What's something that has happened with children that you could not explain that seemed to be psychically unusual? Damn, wouldn't you know it? Just what I didn't want to happen was now happening. Well, I did have one unusual situation take place that I can share. Go on, we want to hear it, the aggressive questioner stated as several of the other 15 or so attendees nodded in agreement. I was co-teaching a 5th grade Sunday school class at a Unitarian church. The kids attending it appeared to be very bright. I'm sure some of them had been identified as gifted, but I would not know who they were. Anyway, it was a year-long class on different belief systems people have throughout the world. My co-teacher was absent that Sunday. He was and is a famous scientist. I would probably have been hesitant to bring this topic up if he had been there, but he wasn't. I told the kids that some people believed that they could see colors around other people, particularly around their heads. Recently, I told them I had read about a way you could see those colors, or auras, as they were sometimes called. Of course, the kids wanted to know how to do it. I explained that I didn't know if the technique would actually work for them. When I tried the procedure, sometimes I saw something like colors around people's heads. It could simply be the result of eye strain or some other logical explanation, I reflected. Again, I cautioned them to try to keep a balance between tricks of the mind and sound scientific principles. Of course, they wanted to try it. I explained the technique. You have someone stand or sit in front of a white background, like a wall or sheet or something like that. Then you focus your eyes about 2 or 3 feet above the person's head and keep staring at that imaginary spot. After a minute or so, you will begin seeing the person's aura in your peripheral vision. If you switch the focus of your eyes to the colors around the person's head, you will probably not see the aura. You have to keep your eyes focused just above the person's head and catch the colors in your peripheral vision. Well, they definitely wanted to try it. They pulled a table over against the one white wall in the room. A boy volunteered to sit on the table with his back resting against the wall. The other 7 or 8 or so children and I sat on the floor in front of the table, looking at the boy sitting on it. I focused my eyes just above his head. All of a sudden, I see this big, long, purple streak of light coming from the upper left side of the kid near the ceiling, going all the way down to the child's head. I am really surprised by the brightness of the purple light and its overall clarity. This shift of purple light is so dominant that I decide to look directly at it. It is still there. I lean forward and turn my head slightly to the side. It is still there. I am stunned. I'm thinking, how am I going to explain what I see to these children? At that moment, one of them sitting on the floor spontaneously says, "Wow, do you see that purple light slanting into his head?" Several of the other children say yes, they see it too. One child says he doesn't. One of the seers explains where it is, which is exactly where I see it. "Oh yeah, now I see it," says the questioner. Since the time has about arrived for the children's parents to come and pick them up, I bring the thing to a close. The children and I all agree that we really don't know how to explain what we have just witnessed. I cautioned them to remember how the mind can play tricks on all of us and urged them to explore a variety of explanations for this experience before reaching a final conclusion. They all agreed to do just that. Several questions about the details of this story were asked me. I really wanted to change the subject and get back to the science around working with gifted students. "Let's try to see our auras," one of the participants says. The other participants all think it's a great idea. Someone stands against a whitish-colored wall, and the others look. The results are mixed. Some see a color or a distortion of light, and some see nothing. Different ones of them take turns being observed standing in front of the wall. Disagreement abounds as to who sees what. All of the participants seem happy and to be enjoying the experience. I am not. Well, I think we can end our session now unless you have some other questions about the studies I have cited and our results from the research we did through the federal grant. No, let's not stop now. Let's explore the psychic stuff more. Yes, Tell us what you know about the psychic things. Clearly you've been exploring that. No, if we don't have questions on the research related to the interaction of the gifted child in the school environment, we'll end it now. But we still have 45 minutes to go. Let's keep going. No, we are ending a little early. You get a break. Thank you all for coming. And with that, I started to pack up my briefcase and the leftover materials I had used during the presentation. The audience seemed confused that I would stop early. They were clearly not pleased. I felt so uncomfortable talking about the psychic stuff. I was off balance. It was one thing to read about it, and quite another to have encountered things that you could not explain, things that just knocked you off balance. My anchor to reality had been recently shaken, badly shaken. I couldn't talk about it to an open group of strangers. It was just too threatening to me. Damn, it was cold getting into the car. I felt miserable. I was clearly out of sorts about the ending of the session with the educators. I knew that I hadn't handled the situation well at all. The weather served to accentuate that misery. The wind even pushed the cold inside the car. I sat shivering in it for several miles. The engine finally warmed up enough to send heated air into the compartment. Lord, this land was desolate. It was just open land with no house for long stretches of miles. I thought there would be gas stations and fast food restaurants at the mini exit that would be between Cape Girardeau and St. Louis. There didn't seem to be any exits anywhere. What little snow there was kept getting resettled by the strong gusts of wind that overwhelmed the constant, ever-present background rush of wind. At least my wife wouldn't have to worry about my picking up a hitchhiker. There weren't any cars on the road, let alone someone walking alongside of the highway. No one could survive long in this weather unless he was an Arctic explorer. It was simply brutal. As I drove on in this uninhabited land, the late afternoon light began to take on the darker hue of approaching evening. This trip seemed to be lasting forever. I was hungry and thirsty. It didn't matter. There wasn't an exit to use. Even if there were one, it was clear that there would not be a gas station. There simply weren't any commercial developments along this unending stretch of road. I began climbing a long hill that was pinned in on both sides by two large stone cliffs. The evidence of drill holes cut into the rock were visible where sticks of dynamite were placed to blast away the passage for the road. The detonation had blown away the center of this solid rock hill. It created the cut-through for this highway. God, this would be a horrible place for the car to break down. You'd be trapped in this artificially created valley. The road rose as far as the eye could see to the distant crest of the hill. At the top, the full blast of the wind would touch you with its stinging cold. How far could you go walking in weather like this? Not far enough, that was for certain. This would be a place where people died. It gave me the shivers just thinking about it. At 55 miles an hour, I crested the hill. Halfway down the other side of it, someone was walking. Someone was walking down the hill. I couldn't believe it. What was someone doing out here at this time of day, walking on this road? There's nothing here. There's nothing anywhere. He or she must be a local. They must know something about this area that I don't. That's the only thing that makes sense about someone being out here in this cold. At least he wasn't holding out his thumb. He wasn't hitchhiking. He was just hunched over, bent into the wind, taking one plodding step in front of the other. I stayed in the slow lane, hoping to catch a look at the person in the side view mirror. I wanted to see what someone who had the grit to face this weather looked like. He had my curiosity. What a relief to know that I wouldn't be tempted to offer him a ride. My promise not to pick up hitchhikers remained unchallenged. I whizzed by him at the 55 miles per hour speed limit. I caught just a brief glimpse of his face in the passenger side window. I was stunned by what I saw. It was the saddest, most miserable face I had ever seen. He never turned his head to look at the car. He just kept staring ahead, slowly putting one foot in front of the other. His hands were stuck inside his coat pocket. His back was hunched forward and his shoulders were pulled into his chest, as if he wanted to wrap himself into them. Promise or not, I could not leave this person out here, alone in this cold. I couldn't do it. As I slowed to a stop, I pulled onto the side of the road. A lot of road had passed between the two of us. Slowing a car moving at 50 miles an hour to a stop takes a lot of distance. He was a considerable way behind me. Usually, when I pulled over for a hitchhiker, there would be a distance between the car and the hitchhiker. Of course, you knew you were going to stop for the hitchhiker before you had passed him. So there wasn't a great distance between him and your car, as was the case with this stranger. In any event, the hitchhiker you had passed picked up his tote bag or backpack or whatever and started running to where the car was. This stranger along the road did not increase his pace. He did not even seem to look ahead to the car. He just kept slowly putting one foot in front of the other, plodding on as before. I put the car in reverse and began backing up towards him, expecting him to start running or to at least walking faster to get to the car. The stranger did none of these things. He just kept moving with his plodding pace. As he approached the rear of the car, I rolled down the passenger side window. When he was abreast of it, he leaned his fully bearded face towards the open space of the window. With no expression on his face or in his voice, he said, "What do you want?" Taken aback by the question, I meekly stated, "It's cold. I thought I could give you a ride." He just stared at me. "I can give you a ride. It's warm in here." Blandly, looking me straight in the face, he said, "Okay." I began opening the door from my leaning position while keeping one hand on the steering wheel. He grasped the edge of the door. Slowly, he fully opened the door and seated himself. Usually when the hitchhiker first gets in the car, he profusely thanks you for picking him up and asks you how far you are going. This guy just sat there. He didn't say anything. He just sat there as I headed down the road. After we had traveled several miles down the road, not being able to stand the continued silence, I stated, "I'm going as far as St. Louis." "That's okay," he said with the same bland projection of personality he seemed to have mustered long before I had seen him. Gradually, he began talking. I would ask a few leading questions that extended his story. He was an artist of some local fame in Florida. He'd grown up in north central Ohio. He'd won several art contests in high school. He decided to go to Florida after high school. He didn't want to go to college. His parents were willing to pay for him to go. He wanted to go live in an artist colony in Florida. He wanted to study under one particular artist there. Well, that artist had moved on by the time my traveling companion had arrived. That was all right, though. The guy stayed there and started selling some of his work to locals and tourists. After a while, he wanted to leave the Florida scene. He wanted to go back to Ohio and maybe study art at Ohio State or somewhere like that. My companion said that he had saved up some money for the trip, but decided to hitchhike up to Ohio for the adventure of it. Hitchhiking would also allow him to have some cash when he arrived. 2 nights ago, he landed in a truck stop. He decided to sleep in a storage room behind the main truck stop. After eating supper, he took his bedroll and his backpack to the storage room and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, a couple of guys began beating on him. He woke up with these guys pounding on him. There was no way he could protect himself. They kicked and punched. They emptied his pockets, took his wallet and all his loose change, his backpack, and even dragged out his bedroll. When they left, all he wanted to do was to hunker down and sleep. He couldn't really sleep. He hurt everywhere. When dawn finally broke, he went to the front office and told them what had happened. Since he couldn't identify his attackers and he had no ID, they told him there was nothing they could do for him. They didn't even offer him breakfast. He just started walking north. That's all he knew to do. He'd been walking for 2 days. He got some water by holding ice in his mouth that he picked up from the drainage ditches alongside the road. That was it. No food and no relief from the cold. He had just decided to commit suicide minutes before I came along. He was actually looking for a place to lie down that would conceal his body from cars passing by when I stopped, he said. Damn, it was a hard story. I believed him. There was no doubt in my mind that he was telling the truth. Now, mind you, I knew there were some blanks in his story. There were big gaps in the time that weren't accounted for. Nevertheless, I believed him. I'm getting hungry, I stated to him. If we find an exit that has a place to eat, I'll pull over. I'll treat you to a meal, if that's agreeable. Thanks. I'd appreciate it. About 20 minutes later, there was an exit. A lone local diner sat on the corner. I pulled in. There were no other cars in front of it, but lights were on inside. We got out. Stuck on one of the window panes of the 2 front doors was a handwritten sign. No credit cards. Wait a minute. Let's get back in the car, I stated to my companion. He looked puzzled but followed my lead. They won't take credit cards. I don't have much cash. He just looked at me. I pulled out my billfold and searched my pockets. $4.83. That's all I had. Should we try another place? I asked. It's your call. Well, I don't think we're going to find another place before we get to the outskirts of St. Louis. That's going to be another good hour or more. I could get what this will buy. We can share it if that's okay. Yeah, if that's what you want to do. It's decided. Let's go in and see what we can get for $4.83. After being seated at a table, the waitress gave us the menu. We were the only customers in the restaurant. The menu said we could get a meatloaf dinner for $5. That was the cheapest meal listed. When the waitress returned for our order, I told her we wanted just one meal and 2 plates. We wanted the meatloaf dinner, but we had a problem since they didn't take credit cards. All we had was $4.83 in cash. We'd like to get as much of the meatloaf dinner as our $4.83 could buy. She smiled and said she would see what she could do. A few minutes later, she returned with a pot of coffee. She wanted to know if we wanted some. She said it was on the house. We did. We warmly thanked her. When she brought the meatloaf dinner out on the one plate, there were 2 big slices of meatloaf, a big pile of mashed potatoes with gravy in the center, 2 rolls, and a few green beans filling up the little space left for them to fit on the plate. She had a spare plate in hand. During the meal, I asked a lot of questions about my companion's artwork. His responses became more detailed as the meal progressed. I liked the guy. Towards the end of our feast, I offered to have him stay in my hotel room for the night. It had 2 beds in it. I'd have to leave around 4 a.m., but he could sleep in. We didn't have to leave the room until 11 a.m., so he could sleep in. They had a free continental breakfast. When we got there, I'd tell the front desk that he was with me and would be staying after I left. Since the room had already been paid for, he didn't have to worry about checkout or anything. He was reluctant to agree and said he'd think about it. That seemed strange to me. There were no other options for him that I could see. He had made it clear earlier that he planned on continuing going to Ohio. He thought the hitchhiking into Ohio wouldn't be all that bad from St. Louis on north. He had been in St. Louis when he lived in Ohio and was familiar with the roads. He thought he could make it. He might even find some paper and do some artwork and sell it, if that were necessary. Once he got near Indiana, there were friends he could contact that would help him out. He'd make it just fine from St. Louis. As we drove into the suburbs, he agreed to stay in the hotel room with me. He didn't sound very enthusiastic about it. He did thank me. We entered the hotel lobby together. I explained to the night clerk that he was staying with me in the room. The room was registered in my name. I'd be leaving the room at 4 a.m. He would be staying in it until around checkout time. I didn't want anyone to get confused about his being in the room after I was gone, I told him. The clerk looked as if he didn't like what he was hearing, but he agreed to what I said. He took my companion's name as an additional guest in the room. He gave me the key and agreed to give me a wake-up call at 3:30 a.m. When I got to the room, I opened my suitcase to get out my toothbrush and other gear. I stated that I wanted to take a shower. He could take one before I did or afterward. It was his choice. As I was speaking, I noticed that he stayed about as far away from me as the room would comfortably allow. Even from that distance, I noticed that he had a body odor. No, he said, he didn't want to take a shower, and he wasn't going to sleep in the other bed. He was going to take the blanket off of it, and sleep on the floor. I said that was fine with me. In the shower, I reflected on the guy's behavior. I wondered if he thought I might be gay. He might think he risked being attacked by me. If that was the case, I understood. The ringing phone woke me at 3:30, as promised. I went into the bathroom to shave, comb my hair, and dress, hoping not to disturb my sleeping guest. When I emerged from the bathroom, he was up. He'd slept in his clothes. As I was gathering my coat and suitcase, getting ready to leave the room, he said that he was going to take a shower after I left. I said that was fine. We shook hands. He thanked me. He said that someday we would meet again. When we did, he'd give me one of his paintings. Thanking him, I left.